So what I'm going to be looking at in these next 4 lectures are what I think are the most important bits of plant biology today, or some of them anyways, one of which I consider to be the conservation of the plant diversity that we have on the planet. And there's going to be a theme running through these 4 lectures, and that theme is seeds. And there's going to be a number of quotes from Chuck Darwin, and this is, I think, an important one, that things evolve for the good of the organism that acquired that trait. And then basically some wretched animal normally comes along and exploits it. And this is very true about plants, and it's very true about seeds. These are simply the most important seeds in the world, because these are... I've got to be out of here by 3, so... No? Chocolate? Seeds are a really fundamental bit of land biology. They evolved presumably because the first plants that got them had a selective advantage on plants that didn't have, or maybe it enabled them to go somewhere the previous plants hadn't been able to go. But it is very difficult now to imagine biology on the planet without them. And with all those birds that eat them, us, I mean, everything that our staple diets are based around seeds. They're amazingly important. So they will be a theme running through this. Of course, you might be saying, well, wait a minute, in that practical a couple of weeks ago, we looked at a bunch of plants that didn't have seeds. So obviously you don't need them. And you'll be right, you don't need them if you want to live in certain habitats, and if you want your range to be certainly restricted to those habitats, you don't need seeds. But the vast majority of land plants do have seeds. So how do these things that don't have seeds cope? If so many things, it seems to be the default setting, the land plant has a seed, how do you cope without it? So let's just have a quick look at the evolutionary tree for land plants. We're going to start at the bottom. We're going to start with the bryophytes, this non-monophyletic group of small green things that never get more than about 10 centimetres tall at the most. Got the liverworts, the hornworts, and the mosses. And we saw the moss in the practical, removed from Magdalen Bridge. And this was the life cycle. So you have the bulk of that plant is haploid, and then it produces on the tips or the sides of those haploid shoots, it produces gametangia that produce the gametes, so a sperm and an egg, or lots of sperm. And the sperm very ably swim from the Antheridia to the Archegonia, where they find the egg, fall in love, produce a zygote, which grows into an embryo. That embryo is then supported by that female gametophyte. It grows into the capsule on a stalk. That's the sporophyte. Out of the capsule come spores, and round you go again. Those spores grow into the gametophyte. So everything there is at ground level. So nothing is happening away from the soil, away from where the plant wants to be. And that really is how they get away with not having seeds, is that they don't need to have a sort of survival capsule that will take their embryo to a new habitat. We then got the ferns, reasonable sized group of plants, very varied, grow everywhere from deserts, through being epiphytes, growing on other plants, to climbers, to trees, to free-floating plants. So every habitat has ferns growing in it. And with the fern, the dominant bit now that we see most of the time is actually the sporophyte, producing the spores from those sporangia on the underside of the fronds, which is just the word for a fern leaf. Those spores then fall to the ground and grow into the gametophyte, which is right on the soil where the plant wants to be, where the nutrition and the water is. Again, you get Antheridia and Archegonia being produced. The Antheridia producing the sperm, the Archegonia producing the egg. Because they're produced really closely together, there is obviously a risk of self-fertilization. So the egg is produced first, and therefore, so other sperm from other prothalae can have a go at it. And if any of the eggs are not visited or on the shelf by the end of the season, then when they start producing their own, that gametophyte produces its own sperm. Those sperm can do the work on the zygote, and at least you've got something into the next generation. Darwin referred to this as reproductive assurance. It's one of the consequences of plants being rooted to the spot. You know, if you're the only one, then you have to reserve the right to do yourself, and that is what they are doing. Darwin recognized that nature abhors repeated inbreeding. He later on said in The Origin that as far as he knew, no organism self-fertilized for an eternity of generations, except in Norfolk. So what we see here is the ability to produce, if you are the only one, a sporophyte. And here are some of those young sporophytes growing from the prothallus. So that embryo that resulted from the fertilization of the egg and the development of a zygote, that embryo was already at soil level. So all the embryo had to do was grow some hairy bits to go down and some green bits to go up. It's essentially plant biology. And it was away. It didn't have any problems about looking for soil at all. So what we have in the seed plants is we have an embryo that is not where it wants to grow into the next generation. One of the mysteries, one of the many mysteries of biology is where did seed plants come from? The fossil record is woefully inadequate. There are various diagrams on the internet, like this one, that have explain the various lineages of plants that have come and gone. The yellow ones, the dark yellow ones here, are extinct. The sort of highlighter pen ones are the current gymnosperms. And it's worth remembering there are only about 1,000 species of gymnosperm, and one of those, the Ginkgopsida, there's only one species in that. So that is a class that has one order, one family, one genus, and one species in it. But the real mystery here is where did this bunch come from? Where did the flowering plants come from? And I'll look at that a little bit in the future, later on in the lecture. So what did the first seed plants look like? Well, they presumably were quite small. They would have produced their gametangia, sorry, their gametophytes at ground level, because it's just impossible to imagine hoiking your gametophytes up into the air in one go. Nature doesn't make jumps. So you'd have had the male and female gametophytes at ground level, but the female gametophyte was not released from the plant. The male was, because somebody has to do the running, and inevitably it's going to be the male because they're better at map reading. So the female stays enclosed in one of the plants, and the male one is brought to it somehow, whether accidentally, just in the wind, by water, by a passing animal, who knows? We have no idea. So what we see here is we have the microsporangia producing the microspores. So the microspores are going to develop into the pollen grains. The megasporangia have fewer and fewer and fewer spores in them until you're down to just one functional spore. And that one functional spore then goes on to grow into, that megaspore goes on to grow into the female gametophyte, upon which sit the archegonia that produces the egg. So you're very nearly there, except all of this is happening at ground level. So there's no heroic transfer of pollen required. So this was the situation that the male gametophyte, the pollen grain, is transported to the female gametophyte, all at ground level. Later on, the opportunity was then to raise them up higher and higher above the ground, maybe out of the way of herbivores. Of course, they've got to fall down at some point to the ground. And when this happened, we really just don't know. It's anybody's guess. These are all just conjectures and sort of trying to work out the pedigree. As Darwin said, we have no written pedigrees for the evolution of anything. So a few facts about seed plants. Where did they come from? Well, maybe this lot. This might have been the early flowering plants, the Cordalis. They're all heterosporous, possibly, obviously, because they have micro and megaspores. They have to do that because there's going to be what the megaspore is going to stay inside the sporophyte and develop into the female gametophyte. So we're going to look at the pollination, which is the movement of the pollen, the male gametophyte to the female gametophyte later on today and tomorrow. But what are the seed's primary function? The primary function of a seed is a survival capsule. And that's what it's really brilliantly designed for. The record used to be 1,500 years of a seed of Nelumbo nucifer in mud in Egypt. Last year, seed were found frozen in soil in Russia that were then germinated, and it was calculated that the seeds were frozen 30,000 years ago. And they germinated the seeds and they got them up to flowering sized plants and identified the species from which those seeds had come. So these capsules, these survival capsules, will have got the capacity to stay alive for 30,000 years. That seed must hold a record, surely, as one of the longest living organisms on the planet by a very long way. They also have given the plant an opportunity to disperse itself in space, obviously, and so spatially, go down the road, but also in time. If you think of that little plant, that little member of the carnation family in Russia, this has been dispersed through 30,000 years of time. And seeds absolutely underpin human civilization, as well as an awful lot of other biology. So the two groups of plants that have seeds are the gymnosperms, the conifers, which arose sometime during the Permian, and these trees still dominate huge areas of the world, and they've survived a number of mass extinctions over the years. Whether they're going to do so well in the one that we're currently drifting towards, trying to avoid drifting towards, we don't know. This is a problem they have in North America. This is in North Carolina, where the conifers are dying the ABs are dying because it's thought to be a new pest that has arrived, and it's thought that this pest is having a high old time because of changing climate. Of course, as we know, the climate isn't changing in America, so it couldn't possibly be that. They are enormously important economically, and you only have to drive through Washington State or Oregon or up into British Columbia, and you see these huge areas of conifers. And go soon, with my advice, because as you fly into Seattle Airport, you see that they are being felled at a rather unsustainable rate, and seriously clear felled. There is a huge amount of timber still there, but that is not sustainable forestry. So here is the life cycle of a pine tree. And it's an adaptation, it's a variation on the theme of the alternation of generations. The female gametophyte is held within the female cones, and the male gametophyte, the pollen, goes from the smaller cones where the pollen is produced. So when you look at a pine tree, for example, like this one, you see those small, tiny little yellow cones, and the conifers are starting to do this, not just the pines, the yew trees, the cypresses around Oxford are doing this. They've got lots and lots of tiny little yellow cones on them. And very soon, when you tap them, you'll get a cloud of pollen coming off them. And this is an example of a cloud of pollen that comes out of those tiny, those little cones. And they have to produce a lot of pollen because it's a 1,000,000 to 1 chance that one of those pollen grains is going to find a female gametophyte. And you might say, well, that's incredibly wasteful. Well, yeah, I mean, biology is a bit wasteful. Whoever said biology was perfect? Only somebody who'd never looked at any biology. But it works, and that's all biology has to do. It just has to work. So masses and masses of pollen grains are produced. And Darwin recognized this as another wonderful bit of synchronicity between strategies and structures, and the fact that if it is a 1,000,000 to 1 chance that your pollen is going to get to its target, then you produce millions and millions of pollen grains. What do they look like? They're quite bizarre. They look like that, which, I don't know what that is, a couple of eggs in an egg cup. Those are air sacs. Those give the pollen grains buoyancy because they've got to go a long way. They've got to go in the wind. The record is about 100 kilometers that pollen has been tracked as traveling. I don't know whether it hit its target, I don't know. So that's the male gametophyte. That's what's going to be spread in the wind. What's it got to hit? It's got to hit the female cone. And just at the tip of those little scales on the female cone, there is a pollen drop, and that's where the pollen has to land. Because hidden underneath those scales on the female cone is the female gametophyte of his dreams. And there she is sitting. She's similar in size to the fern gametophytes we saw in the practical. So a few millimeters across, a couple of thousand cells perhaps. So that pollen grain lands on the pollen drop. It germinates, it produces a pollen tube, and then out of the end of the pollen tube come the sperm that fertilize the egg. The egg grows into a zygote, an embryo, and then stops growing because it's not like the moss and the fern where it's in the right place. It stops growing because it's up the tree. So it needs protection for the journey out of the plant, and that's going to come from the integuments, from part of the female cone. It needs some food, And in the time-honoured way, the food for the embryo is the female gametophyte, just like it is in the moss, just like it is in the fern. So that food supply, which is haploid, with the diploid embryo and the diploid integuments, sets off as this survival capsule. And they come out of the cone with their wings on. Those wings just help to slow the fall so that as it falls, there's more chance of it being blown away. Now you might be saying, well, that's really good. You know, plants want their seeds to get further away from their parent plants. This is another conundrum that plants have. If your parents are happy growing where they are, that would be a good place for their offspring to grow up. The problem with that is, as Darwin said, the strongest competition is between members of the same species. So do you want your children, your offspring, competing with you? No. But if you send them off too far, they're going to fall in the wrong place. Could be completely the wrong place. So another reason why plants have to produce so many seeds is because they're playing the numbers game again, in order to play both ends against the middle and have some seeds falling by the parents and some going further. And it's worth noting, and I should probably repeat it because I probably forget I've said it, 80% of seed plants make no effort whatsoever to disperse their seeds further than just gravity will bring them when they fall out of the seed pod or the fruit. So the whole dispersal thing active dispersal of seeds is only seen in about 20% of species of seed plant. So Darwin observed all of this, as ever, and was completely stumped where the transition came between the conifers, with their male and female cones, which are quite similar to ferns in many ways in terms of gametophytes, and they still have archegonia with eggs in, to the flowering plants, which don't have Antheridia and archegonia, that seem to have gone a lot further down an evolutionary path. He couldn't see where they'd come from. He described it as an abominable mystery. And this is still known as Darwin's abominable mystery. Where did the flowering plants come from? There's this now famous paper in 2007 in Nature by Michael Froelich and Mark Chase, known as Froelich and Chase. And the title of this paper was something like, after decades of research, Darwin's abominable mystery, still a mystery. Don't know. Could be anything. What we do know is we can describe flowering plants, and they have this thing called the carpel. And the carpel consists of the ovary, the style, and the stigma. And within the flowers of plants, you get different numbers of carpels. Things like the legumes have one. Things like the hellebore that we looked at maybe had 5, 6, or 7 carpels. Here is that hellebore. And so we saw in that flower, we saw the stamens, lots and lots of stamens, and we saw maybe half a dozen carpels sitting in the center of that flower. So what you have in the flower is you have the pollen grains being produced from the anthers on the end of the stamens. And those pollen grains are immature male gametophytes. And they are looking to find a stigmatic surface. They will stick onto that stigmatic surface, hopefully. They will then, if they're allowed to, and I'll come back to that, grow down the style with their pollen tube. When they get down into the ovary, they will hopefully find some female gametophytes down there who are pleased to see them. And there are the various representations of this on the internet. This is just one of them, varying in helpfulness. I think this is quite a reasonable one. This quite clearly shows these 2 gametophytes, the equivalent of the little green prothallus from the fern or the bulk of the moss plant. The female gametophyte now has got much, much smaller. The difference between the pollen grains of a conifer and the pollen grains of an angiosperm, a flowering plant, in terms of size, is not really that much different. But the female gametophyte is very much reduced now. So the pollen grains are produced in the stamens, or in the anthers rather, which are on the end of the stamens. They're then released or taken away by a visiting animal, and they land on the stigmatic surface. This photograph stolen from National Geographic magazine. Now this is a fairly traumatic moment for the pollen grain, because the stigmatic surface is the mother-in-law. Because that stigmatic surface has got 2 questions for that pollen grain. And those of you who maybe become mothers may find yourself asking these questions when you see your daughter coming up the garden path, and your first question will be, what species is that yo-yo? So having asked it if it's the right species, the next question that the stigmatic surface has for that pollen grain is, which plant are you from? Because the last thing you want to see as a mother is your daughter coming home from a party with her brother. Yes. So it's able to distinguish its own pollen, which is quite clever, and it's also able to reject pollen from a different species. Now, I say they're able to do this. Some of those mother-in-laws are slightly slack about this, and they will let the pollen from related species in, and this is how we get hybrids, and the plant kingdom is notorious or wonderful for producing hybrids. So, and that drives a lot of evolution, hybridization in plants. Somewhere between 25 and 85% of all plant species are hybrid in origin. So where the mother-in-laws go, oh, nobody else is going to see her. There is also a variation in how willing the stigmatic surface is to accept its own pollen. And again, this comes down to the reproductive assurance business. And you do find that towards the end of the season, some plants become more willing to accept their own pollen if it's becoming apparent that nobody else is going to come calling. And so you see that you can produce these lovely photographs that Darwin wrote about 150 years before they were produced, of pollen grains germinating and then being unable to get through the stigmatic surface. The stigmatic surface sort of is completely in charge here, because the stigmatic surface withholds water. All that pollen grain needs from the stigma is water. And if the pollen doesn't get the water, then it'll start to develop a tube, and then it'll just run out of oomph. How that conversation happens is work that's happening at the moment across the road in plant sciences. Hugh Dickinson's group are looking at the whole question of what is this relationship, this conversation between the pollen grain and the stigmatic surface. If the pollen is acceptable to the stigma, water passes into the pollen, it then grows its tube, and it grows all the way down the style, which may be very short, may be very long, or ridiculously long in some cases, and it gets down into the ovaries, and that is where it finds the ovules. And the ovules contain one female gametophyte each. And this female gametophyte now has just 7 cells, but 8 nuclei. So it has an egg cell. That egg cell has just differentiated from the macrospore, like the other haploid cells of the female gametophyte. So there's no archegonia now. So there's an egg cell, 2 sympodal cells next to her. Sorry, synogids, I beg your pardon. There's the big central cell, which has 2 haploid nuclei. And then there are the 3 antipodal cells. So now the female gametophyte is very much smaller. She's still a multicellular haploid entity. She's still there. And she still has an egg, and you can find these if you cut through the ovaries of things like lilies. They're quite big. What are the other cells in the gametophyte doing there? Are they just there to make up the numbers? Well, probably not. The synogids seem to have a very important role to play in the guiding of the pollen tube to make sure that it releases its pollen in the right place. And it's important to remember that now there are 2 sperm involved. 2 sperm are released from the end of that pollen tube. This is an innovation, because both of those sperm have a function. They have a role to play. One of them is going to do the time-honored business of going to find the egg and make an honest zygote of it that then grows into the embryo. The other sperm goes off to find the very big central cell, which has 2 haploid nuclei. Those 3 haploid nuclei fuse to give you a triploid nucleus, which then starts dividing and dividing, with energy being put into it from the sporophyte, from the outside of the carpel. And those triploid cells divide and divide and divide and divide as the embryo is growing. And those triploid cells become the endosperm. And the endosperm is the food for the embryo. So the embryo now is not dependent upon the female gametophyte for its food in the seed and for the start of its life. The embryo gets its food from a brand new structure. And of course, it's not just the embryo that gets that food. This is our food. All those seeds we eat, it's endosperm that we are devouring. It's an amazingly important structure. It's very important to the seed, to the embryo, obviously. It's arguably just as important to us. So the bringing together of sperm and egg is relatively straightforward in the mosses. and in the ferns, because it's all done at ground level on a small scale, and all the sperm have to do is swim through water, and it's going to rain at some point. If it didn't rain at all, there wouldn't be any plants there. The sperm of in the conifers and the flowering plants has to be transported in its pollen grain from the male cones or the anthers across to either the female cone or the stigmatic surface. And this is pollination, and this is this tale of sex, obviously, because you've got sperm and egg involved. There are, I'm afraid, lies inevitably, and there's some fairly unpleasant smells. So it's not a million miles removed from human reproduction. Pollen grains are absolutely beautiful under a microscope. If you get hay fever, you may not think this, but this is another photograph stolen from National Geographic. These are all pollen grains of different species. The one in the middle is a pumpkin pollen grain. The small dot at about 4 o'clock is not a blemish on the slide. That's forget-me-not pollen. So you've got an enormous range of different sizes here, all fulfilling the same function, which is to deliver to sperm. They are incredibly useful in terms of classification, also for forensic scientists. One often hears of people being convicted on the basis of plant material that's found on their clothing when they were strangling somebody in the woods. And one of the really useful things, one of the really useful plant debris are pollen grains, because all of these pollen grains are from species in the same family. This is now an iconic photograph, which you may well have seen, and I think the record is half a dozen times during the biology course. It was produced by Robert Scotland when he was doing his PhD at the British Museum, and these are all members of Robert's chosen family, the Acanthaceae. And they are, this is the absolutely beautiful image of that. So you can identify plant species from their pollen grains. This has been enormously useful in terms of mapping the distribution of plant species over the years. And by years, I mean thousands and thousands of years, because pollen grains are borderline indestructible. They are hugely diverse. This is just a plant we've got flowering at the moment in the Botanic Garden, the crinum lily. And you can see there's very strange little pollen grains on this one, very different from those ones that look like some sort of very spiky apple. So you've got 400,000 species of flowering plant, 1,000 species of conifers, all releasing their pollen onto animals or into the air. The question is, how do you find the right surface? Now, this is, difficult. Think about, we've just got 5,000 things in the Botanic Garden trying to find the right surface, vegetables. So how do they do it? Because it's easy if you've got eyes and legs, and basically you're an animal, the definition of animal. If you take these are pochards, I believe. Are they pochards? Yeah, they are. Now, you can the one on the left, you'll imagine, probably gathered, is the male, with the rather sort of pink beak and the very lusty look in its eye. Very unpleasant, actually. The other one, apparently, is the same species. Doesn't look anything like it, but that's ornithology for you. And you can probably guess what is on the mind of the one with the rather unpleasant demonic red eyes. There we are, you see. It's quite bored, really. So it's fine for animals. They've got all the equipment for finding the surface, as it were. All sorts of animals are involved in this, and some of them are truly, truly disgusting. I think there's no value in an animal like this, really, from a sort of an unpleasantness point of view. But from a pollinator point of view, there is a real value in this one, because this ugly little brute pollinates these flowers, and these are the flowers of the chocolate tree. They are produced on the stems of the chocolate tree. Again, sorry, I haven't got the chocolate. And we have these flowering at the Botanic Garden, and then it's those that then develop into the cocoa pods from which we derive chocolate, obviously. Pollination syndromes are the names that are given to the way that different plants have acquired adaptations to make them being pollinated by different animals. And they can be incredibly random. So you take one genus here. So this is the genus Euphorbia, probably the largest genus of flowering plants in the world, probably 2,000 of them, probably the finest plants in the history of the world. And they are pollinated by an enormous range of animals. From ants, a lot of ants do it, pollinate them, flies, bees, wasps, Birds, the poinsettia, the Christmas poinsettia is one of these, pollinated by birds. Even slugs and snails pollinate them. Now, it's not the fastest way to get, but it is, if you live in a very windy spot like the one on the middle right, it's not a bad way. They get there eventually. So that's an example of a genus, very close related plants using a wide range of different animals. Look at oak trees. In this country, oak trees pollinated by wind. If you get down into Central America, you find that they are insect pollinated. So just to finish with today, I want to start looking at pollination. And I want to deal with pollination that is abiotic, pollination by wind and water. Water being actually a very rare way of being pollinated. Now, it would be tempting to think that pollination by wind is primitive because it doesn't require any animals, it's random. We've already seen the sperm of mosses and ferns swimming through water. So swimming through water, blowing in the air, they're both things that are around all the time. Might be. It might be wind. It may actually be water was the most primitive form of pollination, where the pollen grain went off as a sort of life raft with two sperm in it and floated away from the male gametophyte, away from the microsporangia in search of the female gametophyte. We simply don't know. But you must not assume that wind pollination is primitive, because it has evolved again and again and again. And for instance, here, this is up in Turkey, in northwest Turkey, beg pardon, northeast Turkey, eastern Anatolia. This is the Artemisia steppe. Now, Artemisia is a member of the daisy family. This is quite a relatively recent family of flowering plants. And yet, up here in this very windy place where there aren't a huge number of insects around, this member of the daisy family has reverted to using wind pollination. The default setting for the Asteraceae is insect pollination, most definitely. What, of course, you see if you look at plants that are wind pollinated, you see a very clear example of convergent evolution. Because these are two very different plants. On the left-hand side, you've got a grass. On the right-hand side, a thing called a plantain. Now, the plantain is actually quite closely related, actually very closely related, to a foxglove, which hopefully you'll know, big thing, 6 foot high, big purple flowers on it. And you look at that thing on the right and you think, no, that's nothing like a foxglove. Actually, it's not very far removed from a foxglove. Once you start to look at the actual number of bits in the flowers, it's got the same number of sepals and petals and stamens and ovaries. They're arranged in the same way. The only difference is that on the foxglove, you've got a bright orange fused tube of petals that attracts the bee to pollinate it. Here, because wind is colourblind, there's no point in bothering with that, in that sort of colourful show-offy malarkey. You just stick your anthers way out of your tube of petals and let the wind take them wherever they may go. Now, some plants give their pollen a helping hand. Some of them actually forcibly squirt their pollen into the air, and castor oil is one of them. And so these are that has separate male and female flowers on the same plant, so it's monoecious. So the pollen is squirted out of those little male flowers and hopefully catch the wind and go away from the plant. And this ejection of pollen can actually be amazingly fast. And the world land speed record for biology is in fact a pollen grain being ejected from a flower. And it's this little plant. This ejects its pollen with an acceleration of 2,300 gravities. That's incredibly fast. And you do at this point have to feel a certain sort of sympathy, I think, for the pollinating fly, who lands on these flowers thinking he's just come along for a bit of nectar and to do the flower a bit of service. And he gets pebble dashed with supersonic pollen going at a hell of a rate. Not for very far, it has to be said. But it's got an arrangement very much like a medieval trebuchet that flicks these pollen grains out. You will hopefully have seen the catkins on plants in this country at this time of the year. Oak trees a bit later. If you get hay fever from pollen grain, from oak tree pollen, you'll know about this. All the British native timber trees are wind pollinated. And it's not just the flowering ones like the hornbeams and the beech and the oaks, the conifers as well. So wind pollination of conifers, wind pollination of pistachios, really a big tree, you see it growing in Mediterranean regions. But out in the British countryside at the moment, you will see The alders down by the river, if you were involved in either rowing or shouting last week, you will have seen these growing along the riverbank. And the alders have these long catkins producing masses and masses of pollen grains, because again, it's the numbers game. The hazel as well, that's flowering at the moment. So on the hazel, you see those long male catkins producing masses and masses of pollen. And then those tiny, tiny little red female flowers, because that's all there's no point in producing any more female flowers, because it's not going to make a significant difference to the number of times you're hit by a pollen grain. The birch trees sort of make this wonderful autumn colour in northern Japan, one of the best places in the world to see autumn colour. There they've become rather more sophisticated, and they're more sophisticated because the wind can only blow the pollen out of the catkin if the wind gets up to a certain speed, and it opens a flap and out comes the pollen grains. But even if wind pollination isn't primitive, it's certainly a very useful trait to have if you are a pioneering species. If you're one of those species that marches into unvegetative areas, then being wind pollinated is a really good strategy. And this is Mount St. Helens, which in 1982 went bang. It's a volcano on the west coast of North America. It had been rumbling for weeks and weeks and months, and a lot of people had gone to camp near it to get a good photograph of it going bang. They all assumed it was going to go upwards. Unfortunately, it went sideways at 500 miles an hour and 500 degrees centigrade, and several of the photographers didn't get their pictures published. If you go back now, you see the vegetation migrating back into the devastation, and alders are the first trees to get back in there because they're wind pollinated, also because they have nitrogen fixing nodules that enables them to get nitrogen out of the air, so they're good at growing on really poor soil like pumice. All of the grasses are wind pollinated, and therefore all of our major crops, so rice and wheat and barley and oats and maize. And maize is an oddity. Maize it proves that nature isn't brilliantly designed, because despite being wind pollinated, and therefore you would assume wanting to have pollen that will go a very long way, the pollen of maize has the aerodynamics of a housebreak. And it comes off the plant and thump onto the ground. If any of you have grown maize at home will know that you don't plant it in a row on your allotment or in your veg plot. You grow it in a square, because otherwise there's no hope that the pollen will actually hit the female flowers behind. But you can see that in a windy situation, and this is Cape St. Vincent in southwest Portugal, the most southwesterly bit of Europe, you can see that wind pollination is a really reliable way of doing it, because the wind is there all the time. It's a very windy spot. And beautiful bit of evolution here. So you've got your stamens with their anthers on the end hanging out, the three of them there. They've twisted, they've released their pollen, because now that little feathery bush of female stigmatic surface is sticking up in the air, hoping to catch a passing pollen grain. How do they do it, and how do they recognize their own pollen? Well, in some cases, it fits. And if the pollen is the right size, it hits the stigmatic surface, and if it forms a close enough bond, the assumption is it's the right one. And you can see there's quite a strong selective pressure there for once you are the right one, then hanging on to that trait, which means you produce just that one size of pollen. So it's a very, very simple mechanism. It's simple, it seems beautiful, you think, why does anybody else do it? But they do. Why do anything else? Plants do. Plants do a whole range of different methods of moving their pollen around. And even if you go to a meadow, this is our meadow at the Arboretum, I should talk about a lot more later on in the course. There are a lot of other plants in there using insects. We've got orchids in there, which are nearly all pollinated by insects. So wind pollination is phenomenally important, not least because of our crops being wind pollinated. Just to finish with a very minor form of pollination, which is water pollination. Now, it's tempting to think that plants like water lilies that live in water would be pollinated by water, and they're not. Water lilies are a very odd bunch. They've never really fitted comfortably into any of the classifications down the years. and people argued about whether they were the missing link between flowering plants and conifers, whether they were at the other extreme, a very modern group of plants that had just jumped back into the water and had gone off down their own evolutionary trajectory. What we now know about water lilies is actually they are an extremely ancient group of plants. But because they are in water, they are a highly adapted, highly evolved relic group. And what you find in these very early relic groups of flowering plants, that an awful lot of them are pollinated by beetles, because they were around a long time before there are more exotic flappy things like butterflies and what have you. So you do find these very old little fossils, bottom left, of the flowers of water lily-like things. But there are some things that use the water they live in to transport their pollen. Canadian pondweed, which you may have used in experiments at school, the evolution of oxygen in photosynthesis. No. This produces pollen that it releases onto the surface of the water. So it has to be incredibly waterproof, which it is, fortunately. It then floats on the surface of the water. It then bumps into the stigmatic surface of the female flowers of the Elodea, and it sticks on with a remarkably fast-acting superglue, and pollination has happened. Then there's a thing called Vallisneria, which is very elegant. It has separate male and female flowers. And the female flowers remain attached to the plant, but the males are released, and the male flowers float open end up like boats, and they have their anthers sticking out of the side between the petals. So they float around the pond with their anthers sticking out. The female flowers, which are still attached to the plant, their stigmatic surfaces, or the stigma on the end of the stars, are held out between their petals, and the anthers and the stigmatic surfaces bump into each other, and the pollen is rescued from the stamens onto the stigmatic surface. And as the male flower then drifts away, the pollen is on the stigma of its choice, and it can start to grow. So wind, very, very important. Water, much less important. However, an awful lot of plants need animals to move their pollen around, and that's what I'm going to look at tomorrow at 12 noon. Thank you.